Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm Gabriel René, founder and CEO of Versus. And I'm really excited today because our guest is the brilliant technologist, engineer, and inventor, Alex Kipman. Alex is currently the founder and CEO of Analog AI, but Alex is best known in his previous gig as a lead developer of Microsoft HoloLens, the world's first real mixed reality glasses and headset. He was a key figure in the development of the Xbox Kinect, which was pioneering work in interactive games. Alex has been the recipient of many awards for his work in breakthrough work in pattern analysis, machine intelligence, computer vision, and of course, augmented and mixed reality, including the recipient of the Smithsonian's American Ingenuity Award. Alex has been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He left Microsoft in 2022, where he was a corporate vice president and technical fellow, overseeing the mixed reality and AI divisions to form Analog, which he announced in January of 2024 at Davos. Alex also joined Versus as a strategic advisor in March of 2024. Today, we're going to talk about Analog. We're going to talk about smart cities. We're going to talk about some work that Analog and Versus are doing together and a bit about the future. But first, let's start with Analog. Now, Analog is a new edge computing company that establishes a seamless connection between people, places, and things, operating from the heart of Abu Dhabi. Analog is not a product, but rather a first-of-its-kind solutions provider that utilizes the integration of smart sensors and mixed reality devices to mix human needs with the sophisticated potential of AI. Analog's mission is to craft technology that amplifies rather than replaces human skills, bridging the gap between possibility and reality. Analog will be pioneering edge computing AI. As I said, this places intelligence not just on emerging from historical pre-trained digital data in the cloud, but rather intelligence that emerges from live real-time sensor data that captures the essence of our physical and digital worlds. And as the name suggested, the analog world. And I was there with you, Alex, at the AI Davos, the AI house in Davos in January when you announced Analog. And I found your speech really inspiring, in part because you seem to be doing something a little different, and it's right there in the name. Putting humans rather than technology at the center of the company's mission. And so I wanted to start with, really the center of Analog, which is you, and hear a little bit more about the origin story for Analog, your vision, your mission, and a bit about the company's name and why you feel this is a departure from where everyone else has been going in the industry and why this is the future.
Well, Gabe, first, thank you for having me in this cool webinar. I'm super excited to be here, to have a chance to both discuss some of our future collaborations and present collaborations, as well as give a little bit of background on the work that Analog has embarked on here in the beautiful Abu Dhabi. As you mentioned, and I think your description is spot on. Analog is an AI company, but unlike most AI companies out there that deal with pre-trained digital information, whose purpose more often than not is to get to some digital insight, more often than not sitting on the internet, look, at the end of the day, Analog is an AI company that deals with real-time sensor data, whose purpose really is to endeavor on the task of understanding the physical essence of, as the name of the company suggests, analog world. What does it mean to understand the physical essence of the analog world? Ultimately, this is a world of, sensing, enter the sensors. For machines to understand our world, right? I'm interested in building the future human platform, emphasis on the human, not the future technology platform. You need to essentially have these different sensors, understand ultimately people, places, things, and creatures. And if you actually think about it with people, places, things, and creatures, you can kind of explain the world. Places or environments are the containers, and they contain the people, the things, and the creatures. And the working set, ultimately, there's only 4 things you can really do. You're either interacting with another person, you're interacting with the environment or the place, you're interacting with the objects and the things, or you're interacting with the creatures. Now, these sensors, they're trying to belong to our world. We're not trying to suck humanity into the digital. We're trying to authentically make technology disappear, make technology become ambient, and sense our world. They're precise little things, these devices. So they say, please define the term interaction. What does it mean to interact with people, places, things, and creatures? And turns out, if you're a sensor on the edge trying to sense the world, people, places, things, and creatures, there's only really 3 types of sensors. There's the little shy sensors that sit in the corner and they observe the world. They're called input sensors. The more fancy sensors, expose their digital bits and bytes into photons. That's called output sensors. And the most fun ones, my favorite kind, are the ones that exchange energy with the universe. You push against them, they push you back with equal force, which is called haptics. So ultimately, this has been the quest for a long part of my adult technical career, which is my chosen art form, is to really endeavor on this aspect of trying to get machines to understand people, places, things, and creatures from an input, output, haptic feedback perspective. It is my belief that if you actually achieve this, not if, not a question of if, when you achieve this, you're going to have achieved a moment where we're going to have the superpowers that technology grants us, but we're going to be focused on living in our world and, on being humans in our world, aided through technology, which ultimately, to me, I said superpowers that they grant us. Technology gives us the ability to displace both space and time. So I just want to walk around the world with that magic pixie dust of being able to displace, we're doing this right now. We're displacing space. Look at us on digital screens across continents. I want to be able to do this and feel like I'm there with you. Right. And I also want to be able to do this, over time. Ultimately, I want to take analog forward and, do nothing short but inspire the world to reimagine everything.
What a powerful vision. I think it's one that really aligns with the origin of Versus as well. A handful of things popped up there that I think would be useful for the listeners. You talked about sensors and sort of active and passive sensors. So if we put this in the context of a human system or biological system, I'm speaking, which is I have some information that's going out, and I've got inputs coming into my ears, so I can hear things coming in. And I'm collecting photons, just as my ears are collecting sound waves. And I'm able to take certain physical actions in the world, including moving the microphone so that it's, as a type of ear, can share this information, and a camera which is taking inputs, which is able to now share us. And that sort of compressing space and time to where you're in Abu Dhabi, I'm here in Culver City, and we're able to share a sort of virtual space together at the same time. But what you're talking about with analog goes beyond this technology to the point of embedding, not just data in $100 billion data center, but enabling hundreds of billions of different sensors to capture this kind of information, much like we do, cameras and microphones and temperature sensors, and fusing those all together to have a real-time sort of digital twin or understanding of people, places, and things, so that we can then analyze that information, we can update that information, systems can automatically be operating in the background, as you said, ambient computing, that starts to automate all these functions for us, so that in a way we can focus on the things that make us more human and not on the technology itself.
You're spot on. That's it.
And that's a very it's a bit of a contrarian point of view to most of the industry. And you've been a pioneer for decades. We mentioned some of the big highlights here. When you kind of take the HoloLens, which is this ability to do many of the things that you talked about, which is a Microsoft HoloLens headset, which enabled mixed reality or augmented reality, which enabled virtual holograms to be seen in the environment, digital twins of real-time data and objects. But now you see extending that, almost the concept of the HoloLens, into an entire city. Instead of it being one device with tons of different components in it and all these different sensors, now you see a network of sensors that can start to do things like optimize the flow of traffic, or personalize entertainment and environments, or adaptive electrical grids. And these are kind of the notions around smart city that I think a lot of the world has been looking to. And companies like Deloitte and Accenture and others have been sort of selling these concepts for a long time. The question I want to ask you next is, why Abu Dhabi? right? You kind of you were at the center of the gravity with Microsoft and the HoloLens, and then something big shifted here. And if you kind of think of smart cities as the killer app for AI ultimately, because there's thousands of different use cases here. What drove you to move to the Middle East, and why Abu Dhabi, and how do you see that fitting into the future of the applications that Analog wants to deliver and aligning with the vision of this future immersive ambient computing world that starts to automate all these amazing capabilities?
Great question. Look, first, let me talk about let me unpack a lot of the things that you said there. I don't necessarily let me just start saying I love the frontier models that are out there. I use the bejesus out of all of them. I think the level of innovation that has happened with these big transformer models in the cloud that get to this digital inside is nothing short of revolutionary. But honestly, I think it's a step. It's a necessary step in our journey. And, ultimately, to get to call it its natural conclusion, it's going to require more. It's going to require more breakthroughs and more innovation. And in a sense, if you think about, all the majority of the frontier models that are out there today, more or less, they've consumed all the digital data or during the process of consuming with their gigawatts of power, all the digital data that exists in the world. And I think it's you that said this at some point. Hey, if you think about the world as an operating system, humans is just one app in the App Store, right? When you look at the world of real-time sensor data that's sensing the world, I think it was our good friend Young LaCoon that said, hey, a kid by the time they're 4 has consumed more information through all of their sensors than say a ChatGPT will. So to me, it's a stepping stone in that world of just trying to get to the next level of breakthroughs in AI. And if you think about the work that I've done, we talked about the world of sensors. As I talked about, the sensors are saying people sensing people, places, things, and creatures from an input-output haptic feedback perspective. Now, the reality of the matter is people is easier to understand than places, is easier to understand than objects, is easier to understand than creatures. Input is easier to reduce to practice than output, is easier to reduce to practice than haptic feedback. I'm one of the world's laziest humans, which I believe makes me a good engineer. First engineer that's too lazy to move from point A to point B invents the wheel. So I started in 2008 this very conversation, and I picked the easiest problem in the space, human input. If you measure me that point in time, that's ultimately what became Microsoft Connect, this accessory on the Xbox 360 where humans could get in front of the sensor in their living room and have fun. As we shipped Connect to become what it became, like any good engineer, we kind of shifted right and shifted down. Went from understanding people from an input-output perspective to introducing this new actor or actress into the scene, the environment, and understood it from an input-output perspective. If you measure me at that point in time, the thing that yields is Microsoft HoloLens. That's what head-mounted displays are ultimately. They're devices that can sense people and places from an input and an output perspective. Now, here's the cool, interesting part. I never talked about where the sensors actually live. If you put sensors on the humans, you get things like this Aura Ring, you get things like VR devices, augmented reality devices. If you put those same sensors that are thinking about people, places, things, creatures, input, output, haptic feedback on the actual environments, that's where you get things like Alexa, that's where you get things like Connect, that's where you get things like Smart City Fabric, IoT, and digital twins.
Right.
If you put those same sensors, those same workloads, people, places, things, creatures, input, output, haptic feedback on moving objects, you get robots, self-driving cars, and drones. So when you start thinking about this life of sensors, it is the same quest for AI that goes to getting a self-driving car to really work, to do a smart city fabric, to putting an augmented reality device on a human. As a matter of fact, I've been a firm believer for quite some time now that, robots and robotics has been a space that I've been wanting to push in a long time because it's kind of the epitome of this idea of having embodiment of AI. What does it mean to have the embodiment of AI? That's AI with agency, right? AI with agency that can essentially have free will in what it does. But I'm getting past your question. Your question was why Abu Dhabi? I promise this all will make sense. If you think about everything that I just said as paint colors and paintbrushes, the relevant question is, what is the canvas? In the same way that if I think about the world of the internet, where the browser is the canvas that we paint the internet on, if the canvas or the paint colors and then paintbrushes are what we just talked about, the canvas is the real world. So in a sense, the real quest here, to put it in one line, is to create a browser for the real world. Now, that requires the people's sensors to collaborate with the city sensors, to collaborate with the self-driving car sensors, to collaborate with the drone sensors, etc. If you think about that fabric, the fabric of a country, the fabric of a city, and the amount of work we need to do from governance to privacy to ethics to bring all of that, is not a centralized system. It's a hive mind of sensors that are communicating. I can't imagine a better place in the world to do that in than the UAE. Let me give you some context. This is a place that 52 years ago was sand. It wasn't a country. There was no Abu Dhabi. There was no Dubai in the same sense of mega cities that we know of them today. And
Right,
you know
like
what?
San Francisco or New York that have hundreds of years of sort of technical infrastructure debt that you built layers and layers and layers on. You guys just started, well, you start from stand and you build a brand new city.
100%. So if you think about the speed at which this side of the world is moving, the speed at which you can actually impact societal change in the kind of fabric and infrastructure of the country, I'm just a firm believer that it's sunrise here. This place is entering into kind of a world spring of innovation. And from that perspective, I just wanted to participate. If I had to bet, if you think about, in the United States, state, local, federal legislation, and you name all those things having to come together for you to build a smart city. That's why people do it in the desert as a little small city as an experiment. Nobody has seen that working in practice at scale. Now, once someone does that, I'm pretty certain the rest of the world is going to want it, right? So if I had to bet, I'm like, this conditions, everybody's auditioning for the part. But if I had to think about what is a place in the world that has the right conditions to accelerate this, what do I mean by right conditions? The right people working on the right problems with the right attitude at the right time, I would bet on this region of the world doing it. And, putting your money where your mouth is, I have moved my whole family and myself here to go spend the next 20 plus years of my life, building that on the premise that
Right.
I bet it can happen here first on the right conditions. And if it happens here first, it becomes a register, a blueprint for the rest of the world for what this world can actually look like, in a way that puts humans at the center, and in a way that ultimately builds the world as an ancestor that I want to live in and leave behind for my generations to come.
Amazing. I think that's not an obvious thing that everybody recognized, but you were the kind of person looking for this next step, seeing this future world. I mean, a lot of us saw smart city projects over the last few years, taken from a centralized position. Google famously tried to do something with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto that classically fell apart for many different reasons, including some of the ones that you mentioned. Do we have the right people? Is this the right time? Is it the right technology? Is it the right governance structure to be able to do this? And largely what we've seen, even though Smart City has had a lot of promise, is projects that really can't get off the ground, in part because there's a whole lot of debt that has to be factored in there, and in part because everyone's taken a centralized approach. I don't think anyone sees a version of the world that will really work where each city in the world is powered by a different big tech company. This is the Microsoft cities, and these are the Apple cities, and this is the Amazon cities. And as you mentioned, with hundreds of billions of sensors made by different developers, all working together, where you have to factor in things in like data privacy and interoperability. This is not really an approach that's likely to work. And instead, be able to find the right environment, the right canvas to paint on that enables everything from intelligent energy grids to dynamic autonomous, vehicles, to robotics, to holographic data sets, to, optimized logistics and, intelligent hospitals. It does seem like the UAE has positioned itself as a unique sort of potential lighthouse project. And I want to frame for people the real opportunity here at scale is that every single industry has to become smart. The key to making an industry smart is going to be artificial intelligence, because even whether you're talking computer vision, which is sensor based, there is an AI capability at the heart of that. However, you have to be able to integrate this notion of building the real world in some sort of real world model. And a text-based approach, as amazing as it is, and it certainly is amazing, is really limited. This sensor-based approach is really about understanding the real world, the dynamics of the real world, and how these various different sensing systems are going to have to interact and operate, share data, collaborate, as you said, sort of hive mind capabilities. So I think one of the things that's extremely powerful about Analog's vision and your position here is the idea of a different kind of world where it's not just about an individual smart thing like a smartphone or a smart car, but all these smart things starting to work so that the city becomes smart. And then, as you've indicated, well, then other cities want to become smart as well. So this is about a smarter world, right? It's about making the world smart by being able to incorporate these technologies in it at different levels. But ultimately, you're talking about a network. You're talking about multiple agents being able to work together, and that idea that the kind of human or biological intelligence being able to learn from sensory data, building these world models is kind of key, which ties back into this notion that if you look at between now and 2050, the majority of humans in the world are expected to live in some urban environment. So the killer app for AI is not necessarily just an individual agent, which will certainly be cool, but it's an agent for everything. And these agents working together are going to enable these sort of smart city infrastructure, this new fabric. And I suppose it is almost like the way we used to think about city infrastructure, right? Plumbing and electricity and water, power, these capabilities. Now there's like a digital layer we're going to lay over this stuff that's going to now monitor, track, and move and automate these different capabilities, almost like where the city becomes a kind of living organism. And I think maybe this is a good setup to talk about, what attracted you to Versus, and then maybe we can talk about the first project that we've picked as our first pilot here, and then give people a little idea about what we think might be ahead, and just speculate on some of the possibilities that we see in front of us.
For sure. Look, you said it. If there's 8 billion people in the world, there's 80 billion sensors, right? And at the end of the day, it's unreasonable to think about those things not being heterogeneous in source. So a lot of this game, and again,
meaning diverse, lots of different types of data.
That's right. You're going
different
to be
types of inputs and systems.
And you talked about smart city projects like Google Sidewalk, and I think that what they highlight is the complexity that ultimately takes for integrating advanced technologies into urban environments, least of which, more often than not, is the technological innovation. But you also need to carefully consider privacy, governance, and ultimately, community engagement out of it. So, again, I'm going to use my analogy. We're building a browser for the physical world. And in the same way that building a browser for our digital world, the internet, history saw that coming from walled gardens that were owned by singular operations.
Like AOL and Prodigy
and Prodigy.
The first big portals of the web, yes.
That's right. And what ultimately took over was what we call today the internet, or the open internet back then, which is done through governance. What company owns HTML? A company may own a browser that knows how to render it. But, look, we're engineers. And one of the reasons we love being engineers, or things that engineers love, is this thing called standards. The light bulb on top of you comes from someplace in the world, who knows? And you put it in the socket above you. In the socket knew nothing about the light bulb, the light knew nothing about the socket, and yet it just worked. And it just worked because there's standards that govern that. So in a sense, you said what attracted you to Versus. The answer is yes to all of the above, right? I think the work that Versus has pioneered in driving the spatial web as a IEEE standard through the Spatial Web Foundation is a very necessary component for what we're talking about. This whole idea of having sensors that can communicate with each other means there's got to be a standard to be able to do it. So in a sense, I think Versus through the Spatial Web Foundation, through the IEEE standard, has defined HTML for the physical world, and being someone that's interested in building perhaps the first browser for that world, it made all too much sense to chat with Versus. That's one. Reason number two is, like everybody else, I'm a huge fan of, Professor, Friston. And ultimately, I wouldn't be in Life of Sensors for as long as I've been if I wasn't a believer in nature. Right? And I think nature is elegant because of its simplicity, right? You and I are 40-volt batteries that have developed consciousness, not because we had to consume before we were born, the infinite knowledge of the digital internet, but because we used, concepts like active inferencing or the free energy principle to learn, right? I think when you start thinking about, the way that nature uses knowledge-oriented models, right? Between symbol, the idea, and the actual, make a tremendous amount of sense. I say cat, you thought about a cat, everybody thought about a cat. Cat is the symbol. I have an idea, you have an idea, everybody has an idea in their head of what cat is. And if there was a holographic cat walking in front of us, we'd all say, cat. Right. If you've never seen a cat before in your life, I say, Gabe, this is a cat. And you would learn it with no a priori data. And you would say, okay, fine, I'll store the data, the idea of this thing he just pointed to as a cat. I'll understand the symbol he just used to refer to it, cat. Yeah. So next time you see a cat, you say, that is a cat. I think Versus is ahead of the game on kind of pioneering this active inferencing-based approach to AI. And I think ultimately, if you're going to spatially understand the physical world, you're going to need more than pre-trained data to be able to adapt in real time to the conditions of all these things that are moving around. So I think it's a, look, again, I think it's a good hypothesis of what one of the breakthroughs that will be required for you to have not a centralized system that's, trying to predict the future based on the past, but rather a real-time distributed system that's working through the grid of the city, where you think about graphs, you think about smart contracts, you think about content no longer being stuck to the devices, right? Content is stuck in the real world. The devices will just have permission.
Yeah, they're browsers.
Permission to see it. And maybe the robot walking around can't see the thing that's on my table, but maybe you as a guest, when you come visit me in my house, can see it. And that all has to happen devoid of human, right? So when I think about all of that in context, and all the work that Versus is doing in, creating what I'll call some of the necessary paint colors and paintbrushes, I just want to paint over my canvas. So from that perspective, it was super, it has been pretty incredible to find like-minded people in the world like Versus to partner with on accelerating this journey, starting with here in the UAE.
That's amazing. You said so many things. I am immediately regretting that we're going to do a short talk today, and wish I could double the time. So I think we'll probably, at the very least, continue this in the future. But let me touch on a few things before we move on to some of the specifics of our first project and maybe what's beyond that. It's like hearing an echo, right? The notion that often systems start going from sort of 0 to 1 by brute forcing it. And this is what we saw with AOL, what we saw with Prodigy. You know, the very first way most people got online was they got a CD-ROM, they put it in, and they were kind of in the America Online portal. Netscape comes out, you know, by the way, AOL got so big it bought Warner Brothers, right? But then Netscape came along, and turned out to be the fastest growing company, I think, of all time, and said, well, here's the whole web, right? And suddenly the whole thing could open up. Anyone could publish, anyone could access anyone else's sites, and then you could link to these. And this obviously changed everything, led to where we are today. And I agree that this is the, you know, when you think about a fabric, you have to think of lots of threads being woven together. That's how you build it. And so definitely the standards, you know, the vision that we had for the spatial web, you know, included this idea that you need ways of interoperably sharing information. If you're going to have holographic data, which now, by the way, we've seen, you know, Apple's, you know, headset come out just last week. Meta announced their latest one, which is starting to look like real glasses. And so the technology is getting easier and easier. You can see that the biggest players in the world are making the same bets on AI, robotics, IoT, autonomous vehicles, and holographic, data sets. And even the headsets, you know, are part of this sort of interaction layer. And you're right to think of this, I think, through this lens of a browser. And we often talk about HTML and HTTP, and we talk about HSML and HSTP as a spatial layer that needs to manage these things, including permissions and governance. But we almost never say the word browser because people kind of haven't gotten that far yet, you know, the kind of average person. But Alex is telling everyone here today that's exactly what it's about. And even in the Spatial Web book, we talk about the Spatial Web browser being the thing that the devices are using, the things that the robots are using, the thing that the humans are using. It's all the same. It's a shared digital physical interface to the same data set. So it really becomes about how do you structure that data in a way that you can make sure that it's coherent with the real world environment or the situation that's happening. So I think that this idea of a fabric that you need to build, that it becomes this new infrastructure layer for the world, I believe this is the biggest opportunity in history. And I think this is it feels a bit like the dawn of the industrial era, but it's now a new era, right? It's kind of people call it the post-information age or the intelligence age. But that's what it's about. It's about this sort of fusion of this. And I love Analog's vision for keeping humans at the center of that, because I think that really aligns with Versa's vision. As you talked about spatial web technology, we talk about active inference and the need for these systems to be able to make sense of information very efficiently, be able to be very, compute efficient, to be able to operate on small devices, 100 billion devices instead of $100 billion data center, without saying, disparaging any of the amazing work that I think our colleagues are doing around engineering these large solutions. As you said, it does feel like a stepping stone. One of the things we talked about when we first connected here was let's kind of start to show a series of these stepping stones in real world commercial use cases that take these broader technological architectures and designs and apply them to real world use cases that can have real world impact in industry and business. And so we picked a first one after looking at several here, and we've several more to do, which maybe we'll chat a bit about some of our brighter ideas. But as a starting point, we talked about this notion of when you think about smart city, traffic congestion is actually one of the top things. It comes out all the time. There's all kinds of ways of thinking about things like optimized energy grids and dynamic entertainment and all this, but traffic ends up being a really huge central problem. And looking at the future of autonomous cars, we have traffic with humans. If autonomous cars are just learning from our past patterns, they're not necessarily going to solve these congestion issues. And so looking at demand in a city like whether that's Abu Dhabi or New York, we're certainly starting in the UAE. Beyond normal approaches to traffic congestion, where with Versus we've taken the spatial web standards and we've integrated them with active inference capabilities that lead to what we call Genius, right? Our Genius platform, which is the first set of projects that we're working on here. The first one I think of as sort of dynamic taxi services, right? And so how do you get the right amount of cabs, make sure they're in service, and get them to the right locations for the right people at the right time? And most approaches are just going to look at things like traffic congestion, and they're going to look at sort of like that data. But with Genius, we know we can use all this different information, sensor data along with statistical data. So we want to factor in things not just like demand and congestion, but things like weather, things like flight data. How many people have flown in for the weekend? What kind of events may be taking place? And because of the various combinations of being able to fuse data together and then do these sort of predictive modeling of active inference, Genius really brings a whole kind of new capability set, a new set of colors, as you said, to apply your paintbrush to. And so I just wanted to see if you speak briefly about the idea of applying Genius to this first use case, and then let's talk about some of the other ones as well.
Yeah, look, I think you nailed it. I think, it's everything that you just said about taxi optimizations plus. So when I think about, and it could be taxis, it could be ships, it could be airplanes, it could be airlines. So much of it is, you have a fleet of things that have people or not that need to go in them. People have their own schedules. They get sick. They show up to work, and life happens. These things need maintenance. We know how to do predictive maintenance, but predictive maintenance also requires appropriate supply chaining, making sure that there's the right part, and if there's the right part, is there the right mechanic? When you put all of that, everything you said, plus all of that together, becomes a very interesting problem to say, look, as a business, in this case, I'm a taxi company, but think about how many companies I could be, and I'm trying to optimally manage my fleet across my supply chain, across my set of fleet operators, across what they're actually trying to do, which is solve some very human needs. How do I get the optimal equation that ultimately allows me to be the most efficient with managing the whole thing while having the least amount of costs and potentially using the least amount of energy. And you start thinking about that, and at these types of scales, particularly once you can then apply it to anybody who has a fleet of anything, it's a very powerful construct to try to enter in its totality. And it's one that, for sure, you can write algorithms to go do it, and you can feed it all the historical pre-trained data that exists, and you still wouldn't be able to predict that whole chain as it's happening live in a consistent basis, right? So in a sense, I think, as you said, or as I'm going to say now, I think ultimately vision is cheap. Vision is easy for us to be like, smart city this, smart city that. Vision is cheap because execution is hard.
Right.
Execution is hard because it's path dependent. You need to pick this path to that path to that path and need to be right. So in a sense, look, I'm a big believer of let's not debate it. Let's iterate it. Let's come up with specific little problems that aren't that little. What we just talked about is not a little problem.
Yeah, atomic problems that could apply to $1 trillion markets.
Showcasing, because the world is not missing sensors. The world is not missing devices that have sensors in them. The world is missing real world business solutions that demonstrate in practice, not a demonstration of what it could be, not a proof of concept of what it could be, but a real live deployment of these things where you can, again, register and say, look, it goes from A to B. And there was a before I had this thing working and an after. And I can tell you in dollars and cents, the impact that it can have in the total life cycle of the human experience. So from that perspective, look, I'm excited about this first one, but as you mentioned, and I will say it's an ambitious project, but it's the tiniest one in the world of ambition. Is the first one in a sequence of projects that start getting us to learn, right? If so much of this world is not done and is easy to talk about, the doing is the hard part. So in that world, it's how do you learn? How do you get that learning cycle going? How do we start driving the innovation you guys have been putting on together for some time now on the Genius platform to actually rev the engine with real data and a real context running through the system to start to understanding, and then we iterate. And there's going to be iteration required to get to the destination. And that's the fun part, is when you can get, the different componentry from the solutions to the platform, and I'm putting Genius in this platform type conversation, to the devices. In this case, you'd be the taxis that are trying to drive to the city, all together as one system, where we can take the expertise of each group, the insight of each group, and put it together with metrics. And we talk a lot about objectives and key results, right? Let's come up with global objectives for these things. But let's understand measurable key results, and then let's measure. And measurable key results should have a real impact that's demonstratable, that achieve any one of these objectives. So yes, it's the first. Yes, it's exciting. And I think in not so long amount of time, we'll be able to have real tangible proof of this world that is fascinating to talk about in a webinar, but it becomes significantly more delicious to experience in real life.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to sharing those results in the near future here. I think you touched on several things that are worth teasing out. Number one, all the work that we started doing in logistics, people often ask us, why did you guys start working in logistics? You wrote this web about spatial web, and then you're working in warehouses. I think one of the big insights came from one of our co-founders, was that the world is just a logistics problem with respect to most of the operations of the world. And it turns out the inside of a warehouse looks just like a city. You've got these streets, you've got rows and columns, you got addresses that go up and down the sort of the buildings, and then you've literally got the dock, which is like a port. And you've got your where trucks and things are pulling in. Solving these problems that are essentially logistical problems, which have to do with inventory, meaning in case people going into taxis, whether or not they're on their way from their location, meaning that the flight even make it, as an example, what the current set of conditions are inside the congestion or demand that's happening inside the city, and being able to intelligently route those things. Applies from everything from, you said, sort of fleet management, but this applies to actually the inside of every warehouse on the planet. This applies to every port in the world. So when Alex and versus the teams together, we're looking at options. Okay, well, what's a real world problem that can be solved in near term that we can improve today, but that puts us on the path to solving one of the hardest set of challenges around orchestration and coordination within the broader set of logistical challenges within a city. And so travel, or merely just moving from point A to point B, turns out that when you got a million things moving from point A to point B, turns into these really wicked computational challenges. With Genius, we have a whole different approach that allows us to then add new data sets that improve this over time. So you don't have to pick all the right data in your first go and hope that your algorithm got it right. Some new data comes in, and suddenly it's like weather changes or some other data set, a flu occurs, and all of a sudden we can factor that into the model, so the model can evolve in real time. This means that it's constantly relevant. And this idea, I think that there's a subtle difference that I want to boil down the entire sort of collective thesis here, which has to do with real time complexity. That the real world is happening in real time, and things are changing in real time. And so sensors are an example of that, being able to model the world in real time. And I think that this is right at the heart of where both analog and versus really overlap. Having to look at the world through this lens that says, what is the current state of the world, and how do we build models that help us adapt now? Because tomorrow's opportunities and tomorrow's solutions are going to be a byproduct of what happens today. And using data from the past can be super useful and actually absolutely critical, especially when we think about efficiency, because I would prefer to not recompute that stuff. But I got to be able to understand what's happening right now. And this is where I think active inference is particularly impressive, because it enables a mechanism for AI agents to be able to probabilistically interpret incoming data and decide whether it applies or not, without having to have millions of examples. And so I love this first project. It can sound a little bland, I think, from the outside, but I think you've kind of hinted at what's at the center of this. This is about the power of automating real-time interactions in dynamic, complex environments. And you can't get more complex than a city. And even today, you've got all kinds of tests and really literally just trying to solve the traveling salesman problem. And we're going beyond that to say, there's 1,000 traveling salesmen that are all impacting each other. How do we forecast something to get some real world benefit that actually means something for people, places, and things, and essentially making those smarter in return. So I think I'd love to talk a little bit about some ideas, areas, categories, broadly speaking, about what you think could be, let's say, colors that we might explore later with our paintbrush on these kinds of canvases.
Sure. First, I have to comment on your logistics point,
Yes.
which is, a funny one, because at the end of the day, when you look at, some of the most successful people, or more importantly, some of the most successful companies ever to be created, is interesting, because if you were to query or to study them and you say, oh, wow, what makes them successful? Some people would say, oh, of course, they're super strategic. Strategic is a game of why. And it turns out that, yes, you need some amount of strategy, but that's not what most successful companies that succeed are great at. So you're like, fine. So it's not about strategy and why. It must be about, they're great operators. They operate amazingly well. And although I'm sure that's true as well, that's a game of what. So if strategy is why, tactical operations is what. What I'll tell you is, like, if you actually look, the companies that are great in the world, that are, durably great, are the ones that are great at logistics. Logistics is a game of how. Don't come to me and tell me why or what. Tell me how you're going to do it. So as we embark on this journey of trying to get really good at helping people get to the how, turns out, that's what makes, I think, great companies great. Just take one example, Amazon, God bless them. I love lots of things about them. But what really makes Amazon great? They're one of the best logistics companies in the world. They really nailed that down. So I can order something anywhere in the world, and an hour later it's at my doorstep. Anyways, paint colors and paintbrushes. Where do we go from here? I think, look, this first example is a great one that takes one scenario. You can think of it as one scenario within a company. The company owns the fleet of that thing you're trying to optimize through the city, and it's a good starting point. I think where this thing really starts unlocking is when you start cross-pollinating things that aren't necessarily just contained within a single entity or a single company. Right? If you start imagining people, humans, turns out, walking through these cities, and what they go through. If you think about, the sensors that people use, that will start getting better and better at predicting, the human condition. One of the things I was most fascinated about always, as we develop things like eye tracking for augmented reality devices, it does that, cameras to the eyes can detect pupil dilation. And if you just look for small differences left to right pupil, you can see actually a fantastic indicator of a stroke or of an epilepsy that's about to happen. And if you think about mean time to those things being fatal, if you can get any amount of head notice, life is amazing. So imagine walking around a city with, one of these brand new, awesome Meta glasses that, Zuck just announced. I haven't looked at them, but imagine they had head trackers, eye trackers, that allowed for that signal to exist. So that when you see left and right pupils dilating at a rate that is not natural, imagine being able to call the ambulance. You could be a human walking in the park. And now we can dispatch an ambulance that can get to you, the nearest ambulance, back to optimization of traffic and conditions and fleet management. The right ambulance that can get to you the quickest can get there to you. And again, we're talking minutes before these things, sometimes the difference between life and death. Let's say you're now inside the ambulance. What hospital do they take you to? I know that hospital is not necessarily the hospital that the ambulance came from. And more often than not, today's world it is, but in the world that I'm living in, it's not. Is the hospital that has the right physician or has the opening in the yard room, or has the bed for you to stay afterwards, that can start stitching together that experience. And at the same time, your family can go get notified. And, you start stitching these scenarios that start moving past a single company or past a single domain, and you start stitching them together on the fabric of the city. That's where I think this conversation becomes much more interesting. And then the value starts becoming much higher, because you start looking at some of these things, and you start looking at the value they can give you, and it starts becoming a place where why would I want to live in a city that doesn't support those types of features, right? That doesn't let me self-select into those things. And that's an example, human to ambulance to hospital. But you can start thinking about those different things between different businesses. What does a mall of the future look like as you're walking, through it? Back to applications don't exist anymore. You're not going to go from storefront to storefront to storefront, clicking on storefronts to see digital assets or holograms or what have you in front of them. Robots that are going by cleaning the storefronts aren't going to just be able to go to one storefront and have to click to another app to go to the next one. They're going to be pervasive on the fabric of that mall. And that could be the human that walked in that needs to choose what kind of information they want to see. It needs to be the robots walking through that mall. They need to be able to participate in a way that they can support it in a world that has hundreds of different storefronts that are different businesses. How are you coordinating all of that in a way that's self-selecting in, with new stores coming out, with new humans coming in and out, with new robots coming in and out, and the whole thing just stitching together? That's where I get fascinated, is how do we go from single domain specific problems that are quite interesting to solve, that have not been solved, that can add a tremendous amount of business value right away, to scenarios where you're going cross domain. Because why do I think it's interesting? You could brute force your way into any one of these things, because you can be in cahoots with the company trying to do it because they're trying to get to a business value. In the other one, you cannot. You have to be a hive mind. That's where we really start pushing a world of governance, of standards, in a way that you can start getting this fabric going across, where people will just self-select into it. Anyway, that's
powerful. Those are all exciting. I mean, from robotics to sort of automated shopping to the logistics piece. You talked about the improvements that this could have on individuals' health. You see these statistics about healthiest city in the world or happiest city in the world, and I think you've hit on something interesting. Cities themselves are competing, and they're a type of business that are competing to attract more people, right? People to live, work, play, eat. To the degree that then this new services layer comes on, this infrastructure, this new fabric, which requires logistics being one of the very first things you work out. And I mean the whole aspect of logistics that we talked about. But then on top of that, there's services. There's healthcare services. There's entertainment services, and there's work services. Things that become automated and instantaneous. And because the city is able to have this fabric of sensors that are all operating, but in ways that then tie into data rights and privacy and governance and everything else you said. And you can see there's a bottom up versus a top down approach here. And from our line of thinking, it's very much about building this bottom up part where these things start to stack in layers and layers. In the same way, you got to think about building a city in the first place as building the underlying infrastructure. Trying to add that stuff after the fact is always a haphazard disaster. I
think critical component is this governance piece of it, right? Because governance will change over time. So imagine if you had to rewrite it all as soon as you decided that governance needed to be different, because you didn't think about it ahead of time, as opposed to ultimately letting the Russian doll mechanism of the state, the local, the business, the home, all kind of dovetailing with their specific governance scenarios, and that thing changing. Where there's companies that are talking about self-flying taxis in Dubai. Imagine that world that those things are popping up. What's the governance? Maybe one day those things can fly at, whatever, 200 meters, 400 meters. But let's say that the governance changes when they move into the Dubai airspace, in Abu Dhabi airspace, and they need to fly higher or lower.
Yes,
What
exactly.
happens when a new building happens, or when for whatever reason they say, hey, right now there are none of these things that can be in the air for whatever reason. You want to have the ability to manage governance side by side, but not, as a requirement of the monolith that you created, and rather a distributed mechanism that everybody is with the right permissions and workloads subscribing to and adhering to. You and I have talked about, I think it was in Davos quite a lot, about how that ultimately yields auditable systems, right? Not black boxes where you don't know why the AI is doing what it's doing, but rather probabilistic approaches to AI that you can quite easily see, not reward-based for the more technical AI folks in the crowd, but not reward-based AI, but rather, again, free energy, entropy-based AI that just goes to the most probable, reasonable choice based on the permissions of what the system has, in a system that knows that this is ever changing and control different people at different places with different, permissioning set.
I think this is a powerful point to kind of wrap up on, which is that when we talk about standards, and really the whole point of standards is interoperability. Why in this case do we want interoperability? Because of everything that you just said, Alex, because of real-time changes. And because if interoperability already exists, then when something changes in the environment, everyone knows exactly the thing that they need to pass along in order to basically enable that. So everything's approved so that you can have agents that can automate all these functions seamlessly, quickly, and in real time. And this is a very different vision of the world than the sort of text-based approaches that we have today. I think these are powerful stepping stones in the direction. But I hope that everyone here today got the benefit of hearing Alex and I geek out on really the future of not just, smarter cities, but a smarter world. And this is what, at Versus, if you look at our tagline, it's imagine a smarter world. The ability to imagine these things first and then take these practical, tactical steps that both enable, near-term commercial value, but ultimately are building this fabric, I think, puts us collectively in a very powerful position to realize the kind of vision that companies like Analog and Versus are pursuing, which is a world centered around humans, people, places, and things, where technology is working in service for us in this sort of ambient computing way. And I think that the work that you're doing, Alex, is right at the very forefront, and it's why Versus has been so excited about working with Analog specifically, and working with you and as an advisor, more specifically. And we really are looking forward to, weaving this fabric together over the coming months and years, and looking forward to having you back to talk about, our first project in the near term.
For sure. Likewise. And, again, grateful for the opportunity to have a chance to chat with you tonight, Gabe. And thank you to everybody that's came to listen to us, chat about these things that we're very passionate about.
Thank you for coming. Have a good night, everybody.